All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss USAID's recently released draft climate strategy. My name is Noam Unger, and I'm the Vice President for Development Policy, Advocacy, and Learning at Interaction. This month's COP26 has further elevated the global urgency to mitigate and adapt to the changing climate. It still may be possible to keep emissions under 1.5 degrees Celsius, but it requires action now and the fulfillment of commitments. That is why it was great to see the Biden-Harris administration in full force at COP26 to ensure that the US is back at the table working with communities around the world. Their leadership and emphasis on the importance of climate adaptation is particularly critical for the Interaction community. The vulnerable communities that we work with around the world are facing the impacts of climate change now. To help bring much needed attention and collective action, Interaction launched the NGO Climate Compact in April 2020. This was the largest effort that US-based global development and humanitarian NGOs had taken to push for joint solutions and collective learning to address this most consequential crisis. It has served as an important recognition that climate change must be understood as a social justice crisis as well as an environmental crisis. It relates to the core of all of our work. About 90 Interaction member organizations signed on to the compact and have taken action around the four core elements, which are: one, to use the power of our voice to educate stakeholders and advocate for public policy change to support those hardest hit. Two, to mainstream climate and environmental considerations into all of our programs. Three, to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions and waste in our own operations. And finally, to learn from each other, to exchange lessons, listen to science, and be humble as we pursue progress. We know there is power in setting a goal and tracking progress. In September 2021, we released our second annual survey outlining member organizations' progress and challenges in meeting the compact commitments. The survey report, called Picking Up the Pace, and I believe we're gonna put a link to that in the chat as well, showed that while members are making progress, particularly in becoming more educated on climate and advocating for policy changes, they still face real barriers to progress. In 2022, we plan to take the NGO Climate Compact even further and push to develop stronger policies, support communities as they adapt to changing climates, and ensure our own organizations fulfill commitments to sustainability. We also look forward to the next iteration of the NGO Climate Compact in 2023 to be even more ambitious. We all need to be part of the solution to pick up the pace for climate action. And that's why we're hopeful with all the USG announcements at COP26, including the Prepare Initiative, Aim for Climate, the Global Methane Pledge, the Net Zero World Initiative, and others. And we are particularly pleased to see the holistic approach required by the Prepare Initiative to tackle adaptation and resilience, because our community has been especially vocal about the need for greater vision and commitments related to adaptation. We are curious to learn more about some of the details, of course. On financing, there's a heavy focus on unlocking private investment, and it'll be interesting to understand how feasible that is for adaptation and resilience measures across the board. On implementation, how is USAID truly going to push for locally led adaptation? On timelines, adaptation and resiliency are urgently needed now, but how quickly can some of these initiatives be implemented? And what is the state of interagency cooperation for implementation of the Prepare Initiative? These are all questions we are very interested in exploring. Because of USAID's existing technical expertise and experience supporting climate adaptation and resilience programming, we know that the agency will be critical in fulfilling the USG's commitments. The first step is updating USAID's climate strategy. Even before the Biden-Harris administration was sworn in, Interaction included this recommendation as a priority for the transition team. Following the President's executive order on climate action, we began to refine and deepen our community's understanding of the impacts of climate and sharpen our recommendations for a comprehensive USG response. We pulled together past and present experts to investigate challenges of integrating climate into development and humanitarian work. We developed strategy considerations and recommendations for USAID on climate adaptation and integration, incorporating feedback and learning from member organizations across our coalition. And we specifically convened a series of consultations, much like this one right now too, with our NGO implementing staff and partners at the local level around the globe to ensure their voices, ideas, and concerns were infused into Interaction's policy suggestions. All of this is to say that we're very excited for today's conversation and to have the opportunity to dive deeper into the draft strategy and offer our feedback into the process. So let me say a few words about the plan for this session. In a little while, we will hear from NGO speakers from around the globe who will each briefly highlight an issue important to their work and how that issue is connected to the draft climate strategy. And we will also then have the opportunity to dig even deeper into the strategy with a series of questions from you all. These questions were submitted ahead of time or pulled from recent NGO discussions on the strategy. If you have a question for USAID during today's discussion, though, please don't be shy. I encourage you to add them to the chat with your name and organization. We at Interaction do plan to submit questions we receive to USAID in our formal response and comments. But as a first step today, we are lucky to have a couple speakers to help us digest the draft strategy and the President's new Prepare initiative. First, we will hear from Gillian Caldwell, USAID's new climate change coordinator, on the agency's approach to climate action and the current draft of the climate strategy. Gillian is responsible for directing all climate and environment work across the agency, and she also serves as a Deputy Assistant Administrator, overseeing the agency's Center for Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure, and the Office of Environmental and Social Risk Management. She has been the CEO of Global Witness and an influential campaigner focused on the nexus of social justice and the climate crisis. We will also then hear from Anne Vaughn, Senior Advisor for Climate Change at USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. She will share some details about the President's recently announced Prepare initiative. Anne has held various roles at USAID and as a staffer on Capitol Hill, and she's no stranger to the NGO community, having worked at Mercy Corps. So a big welcome to Gillian and welcome to Anne. And Gillian, over to you.
Thanks so much, Noam. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. I guess I'm new to Interaction, although I did have some interaction with you all more than 2 decades ago, as I recall. So I think you have an illustrious history. And of course, you've played such an important role in informing the strategy that you're about to give us feedback on. I know before my arrival in late August that Interaction hosted a very helpful listening session with over 98 NGOs participating, and I'm sure we'll be at a comparable level today. We've also had 40 other listening sessions with internal and external stakeholders and getting to this point. So a lot of listening, a lot of reflection has gone into the strategy, which I'm about to summarize for you. Hopefully you have had a chance to read it, but if not, I'll give you the top lines. And as you're aware, we've got a comment period underway through November 24th. We were fortunate to be able to host a listening session at the COP. We had about 30 participants join us live and many others online. So, the listening has begun and comments are starting to stream in. So we're really looking forward to engaging with all of that. I think, Edith, can you get the screen up? Yeah, okay, great. So let me walk you through this climate strategy. I mean, first, by way of context, as I hope was demonstrated at the COP, the US is back when it comes to leadership on climate. And by the US, I mean the government. Of course, all of you have been very deeply engaged in the interim period. But the United States government had over 300 delegates at COP across, multiple agencies. So obviously the State Department was there in force. USAID had a 16-member delegation. The Department of Energy, the Department of Interior, and on and on. And, we heard again and again from participants, on our panels and beyond that it was really great to see not just the US government leading again, but AID very much in action, as we were throughout the Trump years, but, in different forms with a kind of more of a development than a climate lead, I would say, during that period, given some of the politics. One of the things that we've really tried to keep in mind in shaping this strategy is our core comparative advantages, which we see as having this very strong on-the-ground presence and having a long and consistent history of working with governments in the more than 100 countries where we have a footprint. 80 of those we actually have mission presence. And of course, we've got a lot of expertise and deep relationships in the communities beyond the government, both with private and civil sector. We've got our work cut out for us here. And one of the central thrusts of this strategy, as you'll hear once I get into it, is really around moving from commitments to action. And that was a central theme and, a central complaint reverberating throughout COP was, here we're at the 26th COP and there's been a lot of talk and obviously not enough action, or we wouldn't see emissions continue to rise. So, we've got our work cut out for us, but we're really excited to provide the technical and financial support to help the many governments around the world who have now made ambitious commitments that they'll need help delivering on. So let's go to the next slide. Just briefly, I think this strategy is shifting from the prior strategy, which took us 2012 through 2018, which was kind of more targeted pilot-based approaches with a development orientation, to a really agency-wide response. So our process, which was led capably by Catherine Stratos, who you'll hear from later, as well as many others on this call, was highly participatory with, bureaus and missions from all around the world participating in. I think it's fair to say that there's just a lot of energy within the agency. We're not functioning within a climate silo. We've got people on health and humanitarian affairs and democracy, rights, and governance, and many other places throughout the agency. We're really enthusiastic about engaging to help us deliver on this strategy, which hopefully means we'll have access to a much broader range of resources than we do with the directives specifically focused on our climate-related work. So let's move along. Next slide. So this is the strategic framework. And as you can see, we've got kind of one special objective focused on facilitating very direct action that relates to reducing carbon emissions, building resilience and adaptation, mobilizing finance, both private and public finance, partnering with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and amplifying crucial voices with a special emphasis on women and youth. So that's a direct action terrain. And then we have our systems change, which is more complicated perhaps to think about and strategize around, but arguably even more important in the long run, because this is about creating the enabling environments, getting the policies right so that we're able to shift market signals, helping set the stage for transparent energy auctions, strengthening governance, addressing underlying corruption, which of course imperils our progress, and helping drive better coordination across sectors. And then our third special objective is really focused on USAID's own carbon footprint and adaptation and resilience in the face of climate change. Of course, with that footprint all around the world, we've got to be thoughtful about how we support our teams to adapt to climate-related events. We've got to make sure we've got the skills that we need, that we train people up, and that we recruit where we're missing key technical capabilities. And of course, we need to reduce our own carbon footprint and diversify our team throughout all of that. As you'll see in the center, we've got our embedded principles. So the idea, of course, is that these principles should be central considerations and driving forces across all of the work we do. That emphasis on locally led development. And of course, we announced the fact that we'd signed on to the locally led development principles at the COP. Equity and inclusion, this focus on private sector engagement, which will be critical to our very ambitious goal on mobilizing climate finance, the nature-based solutions, and an evidence-based and innovative approach. So we want to be prepared to take considered risks, and we want to make sure that our work is really informed by evidence and feedback along the way. So let's go to the next slide. So I think we should just share this PowerPoint following the discussion, because this is really largely kind of reiterating what I've described. It gives you a sense as to the deviations and continuities between what we have been doing and what we plan to be doing in the future. So I won't walk us through all of that just in the interest of time, but let's go to the next slide, which is a really important one on the targets. So yeah, I mentioned these areas with respect to both systems change and direct action. So our goals for achievement by 2030 in the 8-year period commencing in January are, first off, to reduce carbon emissions by 6 billion metric tons. So that's roughly equivalent of all the US emissions over the course of a year. It's a pretty substantial target. On the finance front, we want to mobilize $150 billion. And that's, of course, by brokering the right kinds of deals, by providing concessionary finance in collaboration with the Development Finance Corporation, by building a pipeline and getting those folks in front of private and public sector investors. The third category is, through that work we do on leveraging finance and the many other activities we're going to engage in building resilience, we hope to reach 500 million people worldwide. We also want to support 80 countries. And so in every single country where we have a mission, we want to make sure that mission is aligning its plan of work around ensuring support for that country to deliver on their NDC and National Action Plan. And in 40 of those countries, we want to see sustained and substantial progress towards achievement of the NDC. So that's really very much the heart of the matter and what all of this other work will point us towards. Through our work on mitigation, where nature-based solutions play a prominent role, we want to preserve 100 million hectares of land and forests. And on the systems change front, we want to really target 40 countries in which we'll address structural impediments to equitable engagement, not just in climate-related efforts, but more generally in society. So these could be laws that are discriminatory or processes that have traditionally shut Indigenous people out and so forth. Let's go to the next slide. So I won't walk us through all these, but we do have an annex in the strategy with very brief summaries of our sort of early thinking or positions relevant to the areas that you're seeing here. I think most notably, lots of people want to know where the U.S. government's going to land with respect to fossil fuel and related investments. And due to our directives and, of course, our commitment to decarbonizing economies, the vast majority of our support is pointed towards renewable energy. There's very limited fossil fuel related support. And that will be phased out over time. We're expecting U.S. government guidance on point, and we will be compliant with, if not, exceeding those specifications. Next slide. Okay, so this is just really the last one before I turn it over to Anne, who's our colleague over in the Resilience and Food Security Bureau, to talk us through PREPARE, which is our new U.S. government-wide initiative on adaptation and resilience. But just a reminder that we're really urging written feedback on the strategy at the link you see here, no later than 5 p.m. on November 24th. And very much encourage you to share that link with your with your network so we get as much input as possible. And beyond the 24th, we'll be digesting that, making any adjustments we need to the strategy, and preparing an associated implementation plan. As you'll note, the strategy is a broad framework for action with a range of activities we intend to engage in, but that's different than the sort of on the ground implementation plan. And in the case of USAID, implementation will look different mission by mission and bureau by bureau. We'll all be driving towards the same targets, but given the unique issues on which we work and the circumstances in which we work and the variability between a country like Iraq and Colombia, the action plans will vary in terms of their areas of emphasis. So we'll hope to get the implementation plans together in the spring, and then that will, include guidance for the bureaus and the missions that are going to be shaping strategies to help us deliver on these ambitious targets. So yeah, I think that's good for me. I'll turn it over to Anne Bond.
Great, thanks, Gillian. And before I get started, I wanted to share the interaction community, just an appreciation for Gillian joining the administration and being our climate coordinator. She's got a deep history with civil society and appreciation for all that you bring. So take her up on that last slide and that last recommendation about engaging on this strategy, and I'm sure going forward. So we're lucky to have her as our climate coordinator at AID. So thanks Gillian for the strategy background. And I'll be very brief to talk about PREPARE, which is an acronym for the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, which was announced at COP by President Biden. And we're excited that it's elevating, and this announcement elevates the US government's recognition of the importance of adaptation. And it brings together the diplomatic, development, and technical expertise of the US government to support the target of reaching over 500 million people in developing countries adapt to and manage climate change. And we would say through locally led development by 2030. So next slide, Edith, please. I don't think I need to tell this crowd what the imperative is for why we need to focus on adaptation. I think you all know the urgency of which we need to adapt from the communities, from hearing and working in the communities around the world in developing countries. I'm happy to share some of these slides and data points with you, but I think we actually owe the interaction in the development community and advocacy community a thanks for your continued advocacy on pushing for the need to elevate adaptation at the USG level, at the US government-wide level, so that we can have something like PREPARE. So what are we talking about with PREPARE? Next slide, please, Edith. So first, it's increasing the level of ambition and the vision of what we want to try to do in terms of adaptation. The president announced back in September at UNGA that we do $3 billion, working with Congress and in collaboration with Congress. Flagging for you all that point that we're trying to raise and execute $3 billion annually from FY24 onward for adaptation. And that PREPARE is part of the chapeau and rubrics and plan that would help execute and implement these funds. And I would just note, after COP right now, the pressure to increase adaptation funding from developing countries who are clamoring for more support as they are facing more extreme weather events, droughts, et cetera, it is huge. And I'm sure you're hearing from your partners on the ground. One of the things that we want to do is make sure we're integrating lessons learned from other initiatives that we've had, that a whole of government had. And looking around who's on the call today, a lot of you have been instrumental in developing a lot of these other big plans, from PEPFAR to Feed the Future to PMI. To the Global Fragility Act. There's a lot of lessons learned and smart thinking amongst you all that we'd love to hear on what you think works best when we're doing a whole of government effort, and what some of the current gaps are that we need to solve beyond the funding gap to make sure that we're supporting countries and communities adapt to the climate crisis. I think the PREPARE is also consistent and in line with our 8-year climate change strategy and our adaptation targets. And one of the things that we're excited to focus on is scaling and making sure that we have an impact across the US government in how we are implementing our adaptation and resilience building efforts, which is really important to make sure this goes beyond just rhetoric and words on paper, but to actually helping people on the ground. Next slide, please, Edith. So what are the 3 pillars of PREPARE? I'm happy to share the fact sheet in the chat box too. But they align closely also with the work that is highlighted in our climate change strategy. We have sort of focusing on knowledge and information as power, and how information is power. A lot of you work with climate information services, making sure climate information services translated and usable by communities on the ground. We have some examples here of what that looks like. And then the middle part is plans and programs. How are we mainstreaming and integrating adaptation and executing these plans? So everything from working on the national adaptation plans and national determined contributions, which has a lot of adaptation components to it, that we're working on disaster risk reduction more aggressively, that we're looking at climate responses within President Malaria Initiative. And these are just illustrative examples on the page today. These are sort of our down payments on what USAID is sort of already bringing to the table in terms of adaptation, and are looking to do much more in partnership with you all to make sure we're reaching some of these goals and targets around helping communities adapt, which includes how we mobilize more resources, both public and private. There's a big push for increasing private sector financing for adaptation and resilience. There's only about 2% of all climate finance comes from the private sector towards adaptation and resilience, and significant needs. So we know we need to focus more on that. And then just quickly, next steps, so we can start hearing from you, is would love feedback from you all on lessons learned from previous presidential and the whole of government plans, see what works, what doesn't, especially in the context of adaptation. Working around the interagency, we have really some incredible amount of energy around the interagency to make sure we get this right and lean in on helping developing countries adapt. And continuing to communicate why adaptation funding is important, including that private sector finance. And then importantly, how do we have strong metrics that we can help push the whole government to be thinking holistically about what it really means to help developing countries adapt. We don't want to be just prescribing solutions, but also hearing from communities about what's most impactful, but also be able to measure it. So we can have some of those successes we've had with Feed the Future, PEPFAR, and PMI, where we're able to show an evidence base and really prove to our partners in Congress and taxpayers and the American public why it's important to do this and how it is effective. And then last but not least, I think we're all of those who just came back from COP are trying to take a break, but COP27 is just around the corner. So we want to make sure we're able to demonstrate that we've made some real movement by COP27, which again is less than 365 days away. So excited to hear from you all about any lessons learned, et cetera, and speak more about this at your convenience. But then I think we'll turn over to the next slide and then also back over to Noam and to hear from civil society speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Anne, and thank you, Gillian, for those presentations and for your openness to sort of our inputs and partnership across the community. And even more importantly, to all the work that's gone into, that underlies what you're presenting and all the work that will go into executing against it. So thank you so much to you and to your teams. I'd now like to turn, we're gonna have several speakers across our NGO community, and we will begin with Snigdha Chakraborty. Snigdha is the country manager for Catholic Relief Services in Bangladesh. Snigdha has also served as the global technical advisor for disaster risk reduction and resilience under CRS's Humanitarian Response Department. And she was the country manager in Vietnam for 2 years as well. She has also supervised and managed CRS's emergency responses in India, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Myanmar, and Nepal. So Snigdha, allow me to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very good to be part of this process today. In CRS, we are affirmed about the local leadership and locally led development processes, and we are very happy to see that this is being emphasized in this process while talking about climate change adaptation at scale. It's strengthening the local government systems and structures. However, what we are doing in Bangladesh in particular about not only strengthening the local government systems at the lowest level, but at the same time, we are also focusing on equitable inclusion, which was part of the discussion or presentation just now, that how it can be extended to the local traditional leaders, which are part of the ethnic communities, and they are out of the developmental processes mostly. And we have seen the benefits of engaging the traditional leaders from various ethnic communities in Bangladesh in terms of their, because the communities believe in their customs and the laws and the directions that they receive from the traditional leaders. And it also includes the language, removes the language barriers that they have. So we actually have capacitated about more than 400 traditional leaders who are part of our disaster risk reduction activities, including a sort of climate-related information as well as natural waste solutions. We have seen the benefits. We also, along with other NGOs and actors, which somehow it was missing in our collective efforts to include them strategically and intentionally. However, over the last few years, we have worked together and advocated for their inclusion in the government policies. And that's how the traditional ethnic communities are now included in the standing orders for disasters in Bangladesh, and is being effective since 2019. So that's kind of big achievement that we can see that how collective efforts in engaging the local communities, particularly the ethnic communities, are so important in this process. And we hope that this is being part of an intentional approach in this new climate change strategy of USAID. Talking about the locally led initiatives and system strengthening, we also think that ICT will definitely be a part of the large scale solutions into this strategy as well as processes. We are currently exploring about strengthening the very local union level sort of digitized information center, which works as a referral for social protection services, but they could also take the role of providing weather-related information as well as early warning information, particularly at the event of any disaster. And they can also help those communities to reaching out to the last mile. So this is something we are exploring, and we do hope that ICT will definitely come as a strong approach in this whole process of localized solutions. We can also work as the connectors with between these traditional communities or traditional leaders, as well as the other existing youth groups or volunteers groups that are available across most of the countries, particularly in Bangladesh, such as the National Red Cross volunteers who are part of the first responders under the government system. So connecting them with the local communities really help us to reaching out to the last mile. And these are some of the very effective approaches. Talking about the building on our experience in terms of use of local materials in building any infrastructure, particularly our focus on strengthening the homes and communities and building safer homes. We have seen the benefits of use of local materials and empowering the communities in our Cash for Work programming by giving them systems and structures and tools so that they can procure the materials, they can manage the sort of finance, and also promoting their technical leaders who can be part of the design process and implement the infrastructure. And we have seen that this has really empowered them in terms of managing the procurement, identifying the local markets, local vendors, and procuring those materials. And finally, of course, doing the construction part along with the local government, infrastructure development department or whatsoever. So overall, I would say that these are very kind of integrated part of the disaster risk reduction as well as climate change adaptation process when we focus on locally led initiatives and promoting local leaderships. Youth engagement is definitely a key part of this whole process, where the Red Crescent youths are out there. Even during the pandemic situation, we found them that they could disseminate the messages using these traditional leaders throughout the pandemic time, where several disaster events have happened, but that they could manage it through texting the messages using the cell phone or as well as various data collections. So that's what I would say. I will stop here and look for your any questions you have or whatever. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Snigdha, for those inputs and perspectives on the importance of and the connection to locally led adaptation and more. We really appreciate it. I now want to bring in another of our speakers and to speak on climate mainstreaming in programming, Sarmad Iqbal. Sarmad Iqbal serves as the head of strategic partnerships and business development with Islamic Relief Pakistan, and he is also a well-known environmental lawyer in Pakistan. Sarmad, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be on this call, and really happy. I'm personally really happy that USAID has actually talked about mainstreaming climate change into all sectors, and really pleased to see the strategy actually take this thing forward. With regards to Islamic relief, as a family and specifically working in Pakistan, we've been mainstreaming the impacts of climate change at the onset of our thinking when we are designing programs, and then later on in the execution and implementation of the programs. All the mainstreamed actions were leading towards larger impacts. I'll give you an example. I'll give you a couple of examples from Pakistan when it starts off. When we talk about adaptation work in Pakistan, we not only look at how the resources are being used, but also what the resources are available in the communities. And that's particularly linked with the sectors of food security and livelihoods, as well as the water management component of it. But the bigger impact of all these sectors being on humans. If the water is available, how is it serving the humans of the area? And if it's depleting, what kind of impacts could be seen at a later stage when certain programs and interventions are concluded or are not happening in those areas. We brought in an idea of a triple nexus approach where we talk about resources for peace. So in areas where the resources are shrinking, we are looking at the impact in terms of depleting water, which is leading to hunger emerging in those areas in the shape of lesser and lesser farming, and leading towards or culminating into social inconsistencies, or I would say the disagreements and fighting over resources to command and control them. And our programs in Pakistan have been focusing or specifically targeting this triple nexus, that we need to use resources to bring social cohesion among different tribes, communities, and ensuring that all these inconsistencies are being addressed with the service delivery that we do under any of the programs in any of the thematic areas. On another note, the areas in Pakistan towards the south, they're facing a lot of desertification because of the changing weather patterns and no precipitations. And that is one of the reasons where we actually thought of how we could look at the 5-year pattern or 10-year pattern, and then devise programs and bring in innovative solutions to serve the sectors of food security, livelihoods, and water. And leading on to, again, the protection and inclusion of all the people in those communities. So I might sound repetitive, but this is the approach that we've been taking all across Pakistan, but in different ecological zones. The policy advocacy work accompanied by our program implementation has been critical or of an essence when it came to lobbying the state governments or the provincial governments to come out with policies which are pro-people rather than pro-government. And these policies were being facilitated by the people who hadn't been actually on the ground. So bringing in voices from the field, which my previous presenter already spoke about in terms of locally led adaptation, but these voices were critical to making or formulating policies which were being which should have an element of what the impacts are on the ground and how people see those impacts and what could be some of the miseries that these people face. We've implemented 15-year programs in Balochistan on just trying to revitalize or reform the process of saving water, conserving water, the underground sources. How can the people be efficient in terms of using water? We've come across with alternate energy solutions, but from a behavior change perspective too, that extraction of water would be an issue if our behaviors do not change of unchecked extraction. Clubbed with this, the reservoirs that we developed or built in those areas where water was scarce was used for providing water for not only household purposes, but for watering the farms, date farms, the vegetable farms, as well as providing water for the cattle's that were there. So it's an integrated approach that we need to take in terms of how the impact could be. One of the recent study that we launched at the most talked about COP is that the climate-induced migration that's emerging as a bigger phenomena, which is spreading or which is devastating everything that they have. So starting from a personal protection and ending up in an environment which is hostile for these communities, losing indigenous identity, to losing the education of the children that are going to be the future of those countries. So it has been a marked impact, and we've launched this report, and it's already available on Islamic Relief Worldwide's website. And if anyone wants to access it, you guys can actually go there. But this critical subject was brought up because of the forecasted impacts that we foresee in the coming 1 to 2 years and maximum 5 years. And it's going to be really impactful if we are not ready with regards to planning in a consolidated manner, which has all the elements of climate change embedded into it. Now, giving you an example of the policy arena, which is leading to financing and the programs on ground, it's like the national climate change policies in different countries talk about reducing emissions, reducing agriculture's reliability on, the fertilizers. But on the other hand, the agriculture policies or the food security policies talk about GMCs, genetically modified seeds, and fertilizers to be brought in and to be allowed, the farmers to be given subsidy and be allowed to use them to generate more productivity. But in the longer run, it's going to have serious impacts. And if this disconnect still continues there, the programs on the ground are going to be failing to achieve the required results that the USAID or any of the institutional donor or the governments intend to achieve in the wake of climate impacts occurring on those countries. So yeah, we're really happy to be included in this discussion, and we would like to pursue this. And Islamic Relief as a family is really interested in taking this agenda forward, with working very closely with USAID in terms of identifying some of the hotspots, the bottlenecks, the challenges on the ground, starting from Africa to the Asian region, to the north, even to you guys, to where I am sitting, to where you guys are sitting. We need to actually think in a very holistic manner to arrive at an integrated thought process, which is resulting in an impactful program being designed for various areas on this globe. So yeah, I'll stop here, and I'll give the floor back to you, Uger. And if there's any question, I would be glad to answer it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarmad. Really appreciate the thoughts that you shared. And to continue to expand the discussion, I'll now turn to Emilio Huertas. Emilio is Lutheran World Relief's country director in Colombia, with experience throughout Colombia and also across the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. He has served as an advisor to the Colombian Health Ministry and as a humanitarian coordinator for Oxfam Great Britain in more than 10 countries, including as country director in Chad. Most recently, he has helped lead Chorus International's new rural economy and livelihood strategy, working to develop innovative approaches to partnering with for-profit companies and entrepreneurs in various value chains and ecosystems. Emilio, over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, as presented, I'm the country director for Lutheran World Relief in Colombia. And Lutheran World Relief is part of Chorus International. I'm so happy to participate in this discussion. We are grateful that the aid has worked over the past months to incorporate diverse views and is now seeking formal public comment. Here are my inputs that are quite concise and directed to the document. In terms of intermediary result number 1.3, bringing finance to riskier geographies, sectors, populations, and communities, our experience is that land rights and land use are linked to finance, and that innovation within a value chain can provide social, environmental, as well as financial benefits. Using impact investment capital and working with entrepreneurs who want to expand while keeping commitments to suppliers and consumers. Entities such as Chorus International play an important role to ensure that this type of initiatives effectively change in a positive way the life of the more vulnerable. In terms of climate resilience intermediary resort 2, we want to champion this work, also critical to sustainable land use and rights. We are inspired, for instance, from our experience working with the Arhuaco communities in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. It's a mountain in the northern of Colombia, who are engaged in a 50-year plan to save their ancestral homeland and restore a vital ecosystem damaged by years of land grabbing, illegal mining, and slash and burn agriculture. Similarly, in both departments, Caldas and Tolima, we have proved record of positive impact on diminishing harmful practices in the coffee industry that can offer widely as learnings and models that can be adapted to different contexts. In terms of improved participation and leadership from affected communities, intermediary resort number 1.5, we applaud that effort to improve participation and leadership for indigenous peoples, local communities, women, and youth in climate action in at least 40 partner countries by 2030. We know from our work to mobilize communities in support of local participatory planning for rural reform, that is a project that we run, that it takes sustained efforts and political will to allow the voices which USAID is explicitly encouraging in this new strategy, voices under threat in Colombia and elsewhere. This requires the work of local and national government, donors, and diplomats alike in many instances. We encourage USAID to support governments so they can fulfill their duties in conflict or hostile context. Indeed, the challenge experienced by our partners in post-peace accord but still conflict-affected Colombia are important reminder to us all how hard we need to work to be inclusive when the climate crisis is also demanding urgent action in such a fragile context. Finally, in following the implementation of this strategy and given the world face on climate, it will be important for all stakeholders to better understand and follow changes in policies and practices internally in the USA, including shifts from the current agroindustry model to a more regenerative form of agriculture, given the global impact on trade of US production and trade practices. Thank you so much. We look forward to continue this interaction. I leave it there.
Thank you, Emilio, for those thoughts and contributions. And I'll turn to the fourth of our respondents before we then will move into some response from our USAID colleagues and then some further questions. I'm turning now to Dr. Marie Canet. She is the Senior Technical Advisor for Sustainable Livelihoods at World Vision US. And Marie is an expert in plant science, along with R&D in agricultural and forestry technologies, holding numerous patents in genomics and crop propagation. She has also led ecosystems and agricultural firms in France and Australia and served as the Director of Global Development Technology at the Global Good Fund in Washington State. So Marie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the chance to contribute together with Sarmad and Snigdha and Emilio. I'm currently working with World Vision's independent local organizations in multiple African countries, including Senegal, the DRC, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, and some others that I'll mention. So I was asked to describe what we've observed in these World Vision local organizations regarding what they're doing about climate change, adaptation, and resilience, particularly for children and youth. World Vision operates on the one hand for humanitarian assistance in a number of fragile states where crisis has arisen for various reasons, including climate disasters. And on the other hand, in a much longer duration framework with health, nutrition, and poverty alleviation goals for the benefit of children and youth in area development programs Those typically last 15 years or more. Both in humanitarian assistance and area development programs, children and youth are at the center for World Vision. And in some of our countries, for example, the World Vision organizations in South Sudan and Mozambique report that children and youth suffer more than others with displacement, more susceptibility to waterborne diseases, loss of their anchoring networks, such as schools. In times of drought, particularly the burden on girls for water collection increases, and nutrition for girls and women often decreases, which contributes further to infant malnutrition. So accordingly, not only sustainable livelihoods programs that we have, but also humanitarian and emergency assistance programs often contain a disaster risk reduction component that's primarily focused on forming social networks to support community-based disaster resilience management. Because in rural areas, women, youth, internally displaced persons, and other marginalized populations are typically excluded from accessing financial services, these social networks are often self-selected savings groups, but they can be other cohesive networks such as producer groups. For example, in Mozambique, there are farmer or fisher groups or fish aggregation groups, or they can be groups organized by local faith leaders, Muslim or Christian. World Vision is increasingly developing projects in which groups like this are built among migrant populations. For example, in Uganda, multiple resilience measures showed that refugee camp savings groups performed really well, and groups with youth in focus. This is a particular aim in Mozambique, where with high fertility and mortality rates, 45% of the population is younger than 15 years of age. So to facilitate that, members of these varied groups all build social capital to underpin resilience and coping strategies. They're provided with messages of empowerment and encouraged to identify and work with local government and other stakeholders through programmatic materials such as Citizen Voice in Action and Empowered Worldview. This messaging supports inclusive, local, community-based decision-making. And we've seen that it's helping to prevent radicalization of youth and abusive treatment of girls. These groups are gathered and encouraged not only in savings and market analysis and so on, but also for locally led disaster resilience management. For example, they're asked to identify practices of sustainable agriculture, climate sensitive, nutrition sensitive agriculture that make sense for their own adaptation, such as in coastal areas, that's planting mangroves, income generating activities, a variety of sorts, including crop alternation and value adds, common goals for managing community water resources and forests. One of the activities pioneered by World Vision, which is often taken up as desirable by local communities within that community-based disaster resilience management framework that has components of both adaptation and resilience as well as mitigation, is farmer-managed natural regeneration of trees for wood, fruit, forage production, erosion control, soil enrichment, and carbon sequestration. FMNR, farmer-managed natural regeneration of tree projects, have become self-perpetuating in a number of countries, including Kenya, Uganda, Mali, Niger, Zambia, and Malawi. Some examples of assistance to vulnerable households to build community assets and integrate disaster and climate risk management in a safety net program, such as I've described, is the consortium that World Vision leads supporting the Ethiopian Productive Safety Net Program, SPEAR. Another is the Accelerating Recovery and Resilience in South Sudan, or ACCESS project, which uses a systems approach focusing capacity building on existing community level structures with faith leaders, traditional authorities, local governance structures, and so on, and training up youth and women leaders specifically in these kinds of groups. Another is the privately funded Transforming Household Resilience in Vulnerable Environments, or THRIVE projects in Rwanda, Tanzania, Malawi and Zambia, where the savings and producers groups are provided with various types of support for building sustainable livelihoods. Newly, that includes some climate finance from our sister organization, Vision Fund. So we're trying to make it locally led as much as possible, with this social safety net as the center of gravity for these community-led disaster resilience management activities. And I'll stop for any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Marie, and thank you. And Gillian, that's a lot to take in. The very rich and practical sort of considerations for the work across areas of children and youth, land rights and tenure, across examples of mainstreaming into programs, and also the critical importance of across all of the comments of locally led adaptation efforts. Maybe we'll pause before turning to our questions round, just to have any kind of response from you, Gillian, and then I'd like to bring in my colleague, Claudia. Over to you, Gillian.
No, I mean, I think it'd be great to get into the questions. I mean, it's very helpful to sort of hear from our partners and allies regarding how they're really implementing in concrete ways against the kinds of objectives we've articulated. There weren't particular questions that arise, but a lot of what was said resonated with me. I mean, especially this question of land tenure and the complexity of that conversation. That's something that we discussed at some length with Indigenous communities in a meeting that we had at the COP. So I don't know, Catherine, or if anybody else had a particular reaction, or if you'd rather wait to get into the Q&A.
No, I would say we may want to follow up individually if we could have contact information to learn more about some of the programs and initiatives, because they sounded interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that. So great. Well, thanks, Gillian, and thanks, Catherine. And I'd now like to turn to Claudia Sanchez de Lozada, who is Interaction's new Senior Manager for Climate and Environment. She comes to us with 15 years of private sector experience as an environmental consultant. And she's originally from Bolivia and has worked on environmental issues in many countries around the world. And so we're delighted to have her with us at Interaction. And Claudia, over to you to moderate some of the Q&A.
Thank you, Noam, and thank you to all our speakers today. We now have about 20-ish minutes for the Q&A portion of our event. And like Noam mentioned earlier, in order to make the most of this time, we looked at the questions that you all submitted, as well as the questions that were brought up during our discussion session this Friday, and selected a handful of them. And we can hopefully get through most of them today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on the people whose questions were selected, and they can read them. They can read their questions, and then we'll give USAID about 3 to 4 minutes to respond before I call on the next person. However, if you weren't able to submit a question in advance, or if you have an additional question, we encourage you to type them in the chat so that Interaction can record them. First, I would like to call Danielle Hayberg. She's the Senior Congressional Liaison at WaterAid America, and she's going to read us our first question. Go ahead, Danielle.
Thanks, Claudia. Good morning, and thank you for meeting with us today. As I'm sure you're well aware, several USAID strategies have recently been updated or will soon be updated, which includes the Global Water Strategy, the Global Food Security Strategy, and the Women and Gender Strategy. How does USAID's new climate strategy align and coordinate with these other strategies? Also, how does the climate strategy align with the work of other agencies, and how does it fit in within the White House strategy more broadly? Thank you.
There's a bevy of questions in that one. Catherine, do you want to take a first pass at how it aligns with the other strategies? I mean, all those bureaus were obviously deeply engaged in informing our strategy, but perhaps you could speak to the first question.
Sure. Well, I'm going to defer to Anne on the water and the food security strategy with regard to the women and gender. I mean, we do have a long history of working with our gender advisors on environment issues. And I think a lot of the opportunity that we see is to further direct action, but also to create opportunities for advocacy and for women to emerge as leaders in climate action. We don't just look at this as yes, women are often more vulnerable than men to climate impacts, and we recognize that, and that is built into our adaptation work. The objective that we are leaning into is also women as actors and women as agents of change, and embracing that. And that dovetails very well with their approach and their philosophy. And so there's many opportunities for us to build on each other's efforts. Anne, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Catherine, and thanks. Good question, Daniela. So I think the process for the development of these I think all of these strategies that you referenced have been incredibly inclusive, and and to make sure that we've had cross-pollination or sort of real integration across the different bureaus, we've had some really fantastic technical staff that have been both part of a drafting working team or a strategic working group that oversaw the climate change strategy, that are, say, from the Centers for Agriculture or Centers from Water, who have been integral in both strategies, so that we are sort of consistent across, especially can speak to the global food security strategy and the water strategy, that we have some really good thinking, and again, preventing duplication of effort. So every time in the climate strategy, if you don't see your sector listed, it's not because we're not thinking of it. Your sector isn't listed 100 times. It's not because we're not thinking about it, but there are also other strategies that are now also significantly leaning in on climate. So when you see the new global food security strategy refresh, there is climate and adaptation is heavily focused on that too. So we hope that it's pretty integrated, and we've been very intentional about it. So appreciate the question. We've been trying to be thoughtful in how we've been addressing that in the strategies. But if you see anything missing in the climate strategy, please, you've got until next week to send in a comment too. So welcome any thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine and Anne. I would like to call now Julia Riggi. She's the Senior Advisor with American Red Cross, and she's gonna lead us with the next question.
Good morning, everyone. So the climate strategy mentions 2 criteria for the prioritization of adaptation investments: vulnerability and a country's ability to leverage investments. The second criteria, of course, could limit access to adaptation funding for countries with more challenging or fragile conditions, which are also some of the countries more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So how does USAID plan to address that potential problem in terms of access to funding? And then the second somewhat related question is, within climate financing, another criteria of this fund allocation that projects can leverage and complement multiple funding streams is currently climate mitigation projects attract the majority of funding streams from public and private sources. So how will USAID ensure a more balanced funding of adaptation projects as well?
Go ahead, Gillian. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'll jump in on this super briefly. As regards adaptation, that was a big topic in many events that we had. We co-organized an event on climate finance with the DFC, and Tom Steyer and his new investment group Galvanize while at COP, and we're really emphasizing the need for more private sector investment in adaptation. It is a heavier lift, in the returns are typically perceived to be, and may in fact be lower. So I think we'll probably continue to see some imbalance there, but it's something we're very conscious of trying to address and overcome. And as for this question of prioritization, you mentioned vulnerability and leveraging investments, and there are other criteria articulated. So I think we're mindful of not wanting a set of criteria for prioritization that would eliminate countries that are fragile or vulnerable from consideration. But as we move towards implementation planning, we're going to be digging a bit deeper on these questions of geography and prioritization. I don't know, Catherine, or if anyone else wanted to add beyond that.
Just second that last part. We were looking really closely at the adaptation, what are the most vulnerable countries? And there's been, in a lot of the most fragile states, there has been a dearth of investment in climate finance. over the years, and how to be able to effectively implement in those areas is something I think USAID has a value add, especially when there was an earlier question about different interagencies and where other parts of the agency are working. So we're looking closely at that and how to prioritize. And there's been a lot of thought and looking at different indices from some of our smart colleagues at the Center for Resilience who've been digging into this. So more to come. I think as we work through that prioritization process that Gillian's mentioned, but I would assure you there's been deep engagement on how to make sure that we are able to engage with the most vulnerable, especially in the adaptation space. Over.
Yeah, I'll pipe in. In our past strategy, we really did focus more on middle income countries or countries that had stronger governments in place. And so the change in this strategy, and the change really with having our adaptation team housed in Resilience and Food Security Bureau, is to really broaden the scope. And clearly we need to work differently with very vulnerable countries that don't have the same level of governance in place as with the Perus or Indonesias of the world that are highly vulnerable, but also have a lot of capacity. You know, some of the government officials we were meeting with at the COP, for instance, really were asking us for help in the design of projects that could then be, that could then attract multilateral funding. So that, for instance, is a good space for AID. But we need to think in a whole range of ways and range of interventions so that we can meet countries where they're at.
Thank you so much for that. Next, I would ask Ashley Thomas. She's the Senior Policy Advisor with Mercy Corps, and she's also the co-chair of the Climate Advocacy Working Group. And she has the next question for us.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you very much for having me here this morning. It's a delight to be part of this conversation and to learn more about the PREPARE initiative. My question is related to data. Good available data and well-used data can make a difference in people's lives. And the data and statistics provide the essential basis for understanding the practicalities of the development process, the interactions and feedback between different systems, and the factors that should shape decisions. Data is also vital for answering larger questions about sort of the process and what we're trying to do. And my question is, what are the metrics that USAID is going to use to measure the effectiveness or success of the climate adaptation projects, which are particularly more difficult to evaluate quantitatively? Where are the data gaps that need to be filled to do this? And as implementing partners, it would be helpful to know the metric system that will be used to better be able to speak the language and to be able to walk the walk and also talk the talk. Thank you. Over.
Great. I can jump in real quickly on that, Ashley, unless I've got Jamie or Abby on the phone. I don't think we do, but that's a great question. And that's something, as when we were talking about PREPARE, and I think all of the climate strategy, frankly, one of the successes that we've had in building up things like Feed the Future, PEPFAR, et cetera, is that everything that you just mentioned, Ashley, is that strong evidence base. And I think we're a far way along, but need to do more. To make sure we're quantifying things. We do already have some metrics that are left over from the GCC, from the previous climate change strategy, that we are using and digging into as we build out, prepare more. So I would look back at some of those indicators. 13 point, I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but we already have some good indicators that are there about making communities more climate resilient. But I think if we're looking at integrating and looking across sectors, there's other ways, say in the health field or in even in democracy and governance, that we could be looking at and measuring things appropriately. So there's plenty of space for more conversation. I think we might have a longer MEL small working group conversation to circle back with, to make sure we're capturing what has worked and what hasn't. I know from the NGO community, there's always a lot of complaints about too many indicators, but indicators and reporting and metrics is also what shows what is effective and make sure our programs are working. So I think we'll have to do a smart balance, especially in partnership with you all, to make sure we're getting it right and measuring what is actually impactful. So would love to have a longer conversation about that. Over.
Thank you so much, Anne. Next, I would like to call Amanda Entrikin. She's the Director of Global Affairs and Advocacy with Habitat for Humanity International, to please read us the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thanks everyone for this great discussion and your presentations today. I'm Amanda Endricken with Habitat for Humanity International based in Washington, DC. We work to address global housing needs and its components. We are all aware that the world is urbanizing, and that presents a unique need in development and humanitarian contexts. The UN projects that urban population growth in less developed regions will be over 2 billion people by 2050, and that close to 90% of this increase is going to be in Asia and Africa. That means more people are going to be in need of adequate housing, basic services, tenure security for housing, and resilience to the impacts of climate change. While reviewing the climate strategy, there appears to be a lack of mention of the needs to address mitigation and adaptation within the built environment and within urban settings, particularly rapidly urbanizing areas. Given the rapid rate of urbanization that we're seeing on a global scale, the large contribution of greenhouse gas emissions within the built environment itself contributing to 38% of global emissions, and the unique adaptation needs urban areas have, especially for the most vulnerable, how does USAID plan to integrate these concerns into its climate strategy? Thank you.
Catherine, I'm assuming you'll want to jump in here. I'll just say,
Sure, go ahead.
We do have a new team within the Bureau where I'm the Deputy Assistant Administrator focused on urbanization. We are definitely doing work in that area. We've also got some new initiatives, including Catalyze, which is specifically looking at air quality and pollutant sources to sort of get directly to those concerns. I think we've also got a range of water-related projects in urban areas. So I think one of the challenges with this strategy is that the feedback we're going to get is about all of the omissions, which we can address. But we're also getting feedback that we need to focus, and it's hard to do both things at once. So there's a lot of things we do that aren't reflected in the strategy, but that are important, and we're gonna have to find the right balance. And part of the reason that we have a sort of all of the above strategy is because of the need for that customization I discussed earlier in terms of the country by country and bureau by bureau dimensions. But it's a delicate balance. What were you gonna say, Catherine, or anyone else?
Yeah, I think that was, when we among ourselves were talking about the need for systems work, urban systems was always one of the top candidates and challenges uppermost in our mind. And I think for AID, the challenge will be that we have a lot of assets that we can bring to bear to an integrated approach to urban areas. We have a lot of experience in strengthening local governance. We have work on energy efficiency, on waste management, on improving resilience in coastal cities. So for us, the challenge will be, how do we work across different sectors to help cities and to help governments that are trying to help their cities put in place more integrated approaches that can further both resilience and mitigation. And of course, in cities, there's such a need and such an opportunity to do both, and often to do them in an integrated way. So I think we're very excited about the potential to help with everything from heat islands to cleaner, better functioning cities, to start looking at things like transportation, which can really improve the quality of life of residents, as well as reduce emissions and improve resilience. So for us, the devil will really be in the details and in how we support implementation. So I'm hoping we get there, but that's really more of an implementation stage question for us, because I think a lot of the ingredients are there to really dig into that area.
Thank you for that. For our next question, which might be the last one that we have, I would like to ask Maya Sterling. She's the Climate Change and Environment Program Associate at the Pan American Development Foundation, to please lead us to the next question.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you, Interaction and USAID, for including the Pan American Development Foundation in this important conversation. My question is about the implementation of Special Objective 3. USAID's climate strategy mentions the need to not only strengthen operations and programming approaches to address climate change and further climate justice within USAID, but it also mentions the same goal for its implementing partners. Would you be able to tell us how USAID is thinking of implementing this, and if there will be some funding available for implementing partners to reduce our carbon footprint and eventually decarbonize? Thank you.
Nobody's jumping to answer that one. So, yeah, I mean, I think, the route to decarbonization has, there's some dimensions which have been explored, but I think there's a lot more work to be done. It was actually the Management Bureau that led on what's being called the Climate Readiness Proposal. And there's a forthcoming sustainability plan, which I think hasn't been launched and which will get at some of these issues. So, as for funding, I can't say. I mean, I suspect our priority would be, the developing countries in which we're working, given scarce resources more so than the NGOs. But perhaps others want to comment. Also, Luis Felipe had his hand up. He leads on Indigenous people. I think he wanted to comment on a prior question. But did anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Maybe Luis Felipe can speak first, and then we can address a little bit more.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Very briefly, just capturing some of the questions before. The USAID policy on promoting the rights of Indigenous peoples, which was approved March of last year, 2020, it's very, very consistent with our USAID climate strategy. It points in the direction of engaging with Indigenous peoples, empowering, partnering with Indigenous peoples, and producing an enabling environment. So personally, I think that there is a lot of consistency and a lot of work that can be done from the policy on promoting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it also resonates a lot of what some of you have said, including your initial presentations by your NGOs in regard to work with communities and on the ground. And Marie Lichtenberg put a comment in the chat box which asked about how can collaboration be done, the work that you were doing on the ground. And I see that for the case of Indigenous peoples, we at USAID are focusing a lot on the enabling environment, the political enabling environment, because Indigenous peoples face conflict with their national governments. And we at USAID we're implementing a project based in Panama City, the Indigenous Peoples Alliance for Rights and Development, that focuses on capacity development, on the enabling environment and economic development of Indigenous peoples. And that is to answer a little bit also Maya's question about the implementing partners. We hope that this IPART program will help model how implementing partners, contractors, etc., can actually work better with Indigenous peoples, and the connection is there. I believe. I think that on the ground work, as you have described here, World Vision and others, is very important. But for Indigenous peoples, if the major levers of power in a given country are not influenced positively to benefit Indigenous peoples, no matter what you do on the ground, it's not going to have effect for climate and for many other things. So USAID has a convening power, and I think has, as Catherine and Gillian have said, we have the experience in many sectoral technical areas to bring together, food security, resilience, etc., to work in favor of Indigenous people. So I'm very confident that this climate strategy will connect well with our own vision and strategy for Indigenous peoples and local communities. Over.
Thank you, Luis Felipe. I was to go back to really to connect what Luis Felipe is saying also with the previous question on how do we encourage our implementing partners to have their own version of Special Objective 3. First off, it really is our Management Bureau colleagues' baby. And so I hope I'm not putting words in their mouth, but as I have understood them, part of what they're exploring is what can they do through the procurement process to incentivize or to reward that type of approach. So that's them working with the lawyers and the policy people to see what's appropriate to do in terms of things like procurement. But I know that is definitely one area they're exploring. I mean, the other area that falls more in the realm that we in the climate team work in within the Center for Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure is what can we do also to make resources available in terms of learning resources, information to our implementing partners. And for us, something like Climate Links is such an important platform, because if we develop something for ourselves that could possibly be helpful to our partners, we want to put it in the public realm where everyone can benefit from it. If we can do webinars, hopefully we can do things like that, or also encourage others to contribute so we can learn from each other. So hopefully we could create a community, not just for aid, but for its community of implementing partners. And also, of course, interaction would also have, I think, a role to play so that we can learn from each other as we try to improve ourselves, as we try to improve our programs. Thanks.
And that is all the time that we have for questions. I see that someone else from USAID has their hand up. Erica?
Yes, many thanks. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. And I just wanted to make an additional comment concerning the special objective. First, I'm Erica Claseri. I'm with USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And I've worked quite closely with colleagues from the M Bureau, so certainly not speaking on their behalf, but have certainly worked in close collaboration. And another element, in addition to the climate equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion component of the special objective is also that we're thinking quite closely about how to conceive of our supply chains between the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and the Global Health Bureaus. For example, we command some over $12 billion in direct supply towards commodities for health and humanitarian commodities. And so we're also looking towards USAID and our implementing partners to improve the climate resilience as well as the footprint, et cetera, of supply chains. And some of you and the interaction community may be well aware of the BHA's leadership over the last couple of years, working on greening of humanitarian assistance and looking at plastics in the supply chain for humanitarian programs and so on. So just wanted to raise that piece as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica. So now for our closing remarks, I would like to introduce Catherine Stratus. Catherine is the Deputy Director of Climate and Cross-Sectoral Strategy within USAID's Development, Democracy and Innovation Bureau. She joined USAID in 1991 to work on its assistance program for Eastern Europe. And since then, she has managed agriculture, democracy and governance, and health projects. And she completed a tour with USAID's Central Asia mission. She joined the Office of Global Climate Change as one of 2 division chiefs in 2012 and became its office director in 2018. Please go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you. One reason why I was going to do closing remarks was because we thought Gillian had to go before we ended. So Gillian, was there anything you wanted to add before I just add a few moments?
Yeah, I can stay till the very end.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, happy to have you make some remarks, Catherine. No, I think, it's been a rich conversation. I appreciate the comments the questions. I've tried to respond to some in chat, and, needless to say, we're open to further dialogue beyond the phone call. And the most important thing you can do is provide some written feedback via the link I shared earlier on in chat. I know we're all really excited to move beyond this strategy and to get into implementation. And in fact, one of the things we've been doing since I arrived is trying to give the teams interim guidance, because the point is not to be treading water while we go through this, highly participatory and fairly, lengthy exercise. So I'm just keen to, digest the feedback, make some changes, and get moving. And I think my guidance to the team with respect to our targets was, let's be ambitious. I'd rather have us fall short in some areas than blow past them all. And maybe we will fall short, but we've certainly got some North Stars to try to hit here, and we'll really need your help to get there. So we look forward to working with you on it. Catherine, did you want to offer anything else?
I would just say we're really grateful for your support and your willingness to share your experiences and your willingness to partner with us. And I think together, we can do some great things. And so thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to Interaction for organizing it and bringing voices from different sectors and different regions and different perspectives. And I know I learned today just from what people shared so briefly, and hope to dig in more. Thank you so much.
The other thing I want to flag is just regarding, I put a link in chat. I think I've got the right link, or maybe it's .org. Anyway, it's a new website we just launched on facilitating, working with USAID, further to the question about how we're going to get to more locally led partners. I think we will, in many cases, need to work through intermediaries who are really close to the ground and can handle grants in smaller amounts, but we are trying to streamline the process of engaging with us, which we know can be difficult. Sorry to interrupt you though, Noam.
No, I'm really glad that you emphasized that point. Thank you, Gillian, and thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Anne. And really, you came to this discussion with the full force of a whole team, Erica and Elizabeth and Luis Felipe, and I saw Lauren Baker and Lindsay Doyle. Everybody's just sort of jumping in and trying to answer questions. And it's wonderful to approach it in that way from different bureaus of USAID. It speaks to the transition to a more holistic approach that you were describing in your opening slide, Gillian. And thanks to so many of you from the Interaction community from around the globe for your insights. And also big thanks to so many of you who offered questions, either in conversation or in the chat. There's so much expertise and commitment in this community and across our community. And in that I include across the NGOs and USAID. It's wonderful to see. I want to thank the Interaction team who've been crucial in pulling together this event. So Claudia Sanchez de Lozada, and also Sarah Nitz-Nolan, our Senior Manager for Policy and Advocacy. And we couldn't have done this without Brianna Gomillion, our wonderful fellow, and our intern team, and the input of our Climate Advocacy Working Group co-chairs, Ashley Thomas from Mercy Corps and Jared Markland from Islamic Relief USA. Today's conversation is just the beginning of the strategy process, as Gillian was just saying, and our collective partnership. Please remember to submit your comments directly to USAID by 5 p.m. on Wednesday, November 24th. And also know that Interaction will be making our own collective submission as well, using feedback from today's conversation and input directly from members. And we plan to release our feedback publicly sometime after Thanksgiving. So we're excited to see the final draft and then begin jumping in and working on the most critical role of implementation. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.